Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's national call. We're going to give it about a minute or two just to allow others to join the call, but thank you so much for joining early. Hi, thank you so much for joining today's national call. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. Just want to allow for others to be able to join the call. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's national call. We'll give it about one more minute to allow others to join. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's national call. It's our National House campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. My name is Renee Willis. I'm the Senior Vice President for Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. On today's call, we will discuss how you can push your members of Congress to support the Eviction Crisis Act, which would create a permanent ERA program and provide other new tools to help keep renters stably housed during a crisis. We'll also hear from NLIHC's Andrew Arend, who will share our current or our just released gap report, which finds a shortage of 7 million affordable and available homes for the nation's lowest income renters. It identifies systemic racial disparities in housing and calls for significant federal investments in proven solutions. We'll also hear the latest on the coalition's End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions, ERASE project, and receive updates from the field and more. So today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the broadcast. You'll be able to find the recording at www.nlihc.org. And as time permits, we'll take a few questions. So if you have questions for any of the speakers, please use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And again, that's the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to get it started with Kim Johnson. Kim is the Senior Policy Analyst, and she'll provide the latest updates from Capitol Hill, specifically the Eviction Crisis Act. Kim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Renee, and hello, everyone. So like Renee said, my name is Kim Johnson. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst here at NLIHC, and I will be doing my best impression of Sarah to bring you the latest updates from Capitol Hill. So I want to cover three things today: reconciliation, the FY23 budget, and the Eviction Crisis Act. And we can start off by jumping in with reconciliation. Congress is back in session this week after a 2-week recess, and congressional Democrats will be ramping up their efforts to enact a new reconciliation bill after the Build Back Better Act stalled out in the Senate at the end of last year. So just as a reminder, or for anybody who might be new to the call, budget reconciliation allows legislation to pass the Senate with a simple majority of 51 votes, rather than the 60 votes that are typically required in the chamber. Any reconciliation package that comes out of this round of negotiations is going to be significantly scaled down from the $1.75 trillion Build Back Better Act, which included about $150 billion in affordable housing investments, including significant funding for the House campaign's top priorities. So as a reminder, those priorities are $25 billion to expand housing vouchers to an additional 300,000 low-income households, $65 billion to preserve public housing for the over 2 million public housing residents to ensure that they have safe, quality, affordable, and accessible homes, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build and preserve an estimated 150,000 units of affordable, accessible housing for people paid the lowest wages. Even as Democrats in Congress ramp up their efforts to reach an agreement on a new reconciliation package, the window for taking action on reconciliation is closing. Democrats have set an unofficial deadline of enacting legislation by July 4th, but really because of the congressional recess schedule, lawmakers will have until Memorial Day to get a deal finalized. Once August recess hits and all attention turns to the midterm elections in November, it's going to be significantly harder to get a deal on reconciliation done. So that gives us about 5 weeks to do everything we can to influence this bill and to encourage lawmakers to include significant investments in housing vouchers, public housing, and the National Housing Trust Fund in any reconciliation package that's moving forward. Democratic leaders in Congress will be tasked with finding an agreement that can win the support of both moderate Democrats like West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who was the lone Democratic Build Back Better holdout in the Senate, as well as the party's more progressive members. Senator Manchin has emphasized repeatedly that the focus of any new reconciliation package should be on addressing inflation, lowering the federal deficit, and addressing climate change. NLAHC has a fact sheet on how investments in affordable housing can help address inflation in the long term and across income levels. So I just popped that fact sheet into the chat. And in addition to reconciliation, the FY23 budget is another opportunity for Congress to make significant investments in affordable housing. As we've discussed on this call before, the president released his FY23 budget request in late March, which kicked off the FY23 appropriations process. Congressional leaders will now have to draft their own versions of the spending bills with the goal of enacting a final deal on the fiscal year 2023 appropriations before the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. NLAHC is pushing for robust funding for affordable housing programs in the new fiscal year, as well as significant funding for our top appropriations priorities. So that's $32.13 billion for the tenant-based rental assistance program, which is enough to renew all existing voucher contracts and expand housing vouchers to an additional 200,000 households. $5.125 billion for the Public Housing Capital Fund to preserve public housing, and $5.06 billion for the Public Housing Operating Fund. $3.6 billion for HUD's Homeless Assistance Grants Program to address the needs of people experiencing homelessness. $100 million for legal assistance to prevent evictions, and $300 million for the competitive tribal housing program targeted to tribes with the greatest housing needs. In order to secure robust resources for affordable housing in both the FY23 appropriations bill and in any reconciliation package, NLAHC and our partners at the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, also known as CHCDF, are hosting tomorrow a national call-in day. Advocates should call their members of Congress tomorrow and urge them to make significant investments in affordable housing in the FY23 budget and in any reconciliation package. We have developed a national call-in day script for advocates to use to help develop their own talking points to urge Congress not to miss these two critical opportunities to expand investments in affordable housing. And I see that my colleague Elena has dropped the link to that in the chat, so thank you very much, Elena. Additionally, we have a few other ways for advocates to get involved in pushing for federal affordable housing investments. So first, with our partners in CHCDF, We are still circulating our annual 302B letter, which calls for Congress to provide the highest possible level of funding for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development resources in fiscal year 2023. You can sign your organization on to the letter at the link in the chat, which I imagine Elena is putting in there if she has not already. And please feel free to share that letter with your networks. Federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations are all welcome to join. And there's still time to join over 1,800 organizations in our House campaign letter urging Congress to include significant investments in housing vouchers, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund in any reconciliation package. And I'm sure Elena is also dropping that link in the chat as well. So to recap, use the call-in day script to participate in tomorrow's National Call-in Day. Give your members of Congress a call and demand that they include substantial affordable housing investments in FY23 and in any reconciliation package. And if you haven't done so already, sign your organization on to the 302B or HoUSed campaign letters. And before handing the call back over to Renee, I also wanted to provide an update on the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act, which was introduced in the Senate by Senators Michael Bennet of Colorado and Rob Portman of Ohio, with co-sponsors Senators Todd Young of Indiana and Sherrod Brown of Ohio. The Eviction Crisis Act and the Stable Families Act, its soon to be introduced companion bill from Representative Richie Torres, would create a permanent emergency rental assistance program to keep renters stably housed and protect individuals, families, and communities from the devastating impacts of eviction. When enacted, the bill would create a permanent emergency assistance fund funded at $3 billion per year to provide short-term direct financial assistance and stability services to low-income households facing an unexpected economic shock, to ensure that those households are stabilized quickly and effectively before they ever have to face a day in eviction court. The bill would build on the infrastructure that state and local governments have worked so hard creating over the past 2 years to administer emergency rental assistance programs during the pandemic. And it would incorporate lessons learned to ensure that those funds are distributed quickly, equitably, and effectively. We are circulating a sign-on letter urging Congress to quickly enact the Eviction Crisis Act. And again, all organizations are welcome to join that sign-on at the link that Elena dropped. Always a step ahead of the speakers. Great job, Elena. Thank you. And so that is it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions. And in the meantime, I'll turn it back over to Renee.
Thank you so much, Kim. And thank you for that recap as well on what advocates can do. It looks like we have just a few questions that have come in. So we have Arend who's asking, is this the bill that also requires collection of eviction data? If so, I have some questions about that.
Yeah, so that is the bill. The Eviction Crisis Act also has a data collection component in order to create a federal eviction database. As of now, there's no way to, or there's no, I guess, federal collection of evictions. So there's no real collection of there's no way to know how often evictions are happening, for how much money these people are facing eviction, other than the very, very important work that's being done at Eviction Lab with Princeton University. And so that would create, the Eviction Crisis Act would create that federal database. There have been some concerns around privacy. We want to ensure that tenants' privacy is respected and that they are not evicted for facing eviction in the past or unable to find housing for a past eviction. And so we've been working very closely with our partners at the National Housing Law Project and the ACLU to make sure that all of those important protections are in place. The House companion bill, the Stable Families Act, being introduced by Representative Richie Torres, only has that emergency assistance fund component and doesn't actually have the component related to the eviction database.
Great, thank you, Kim. We have a question from Kim who says, are there significant differences between the Emergency Assistance Program in the Eviction Crisis Act and the current ERA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are some differences in how long households can receive that emergency assistance funding. it's a little bit different, in part because it's meant to address one-time emergency like a broken down car or an unreimbursed medical bill that puts a family at risk of eviction or housing instability because they're no longer able to pay that rent. We're also incorporating a lot of the lessons learned from the implementation of that emergency rental assistance into the bill to make sure that we're not, that we're taking into account all of the great information that we've learned from our partners running those emergency rental assistance programs and ensure that that new program would be both effective and equitable.
Thank you. We have a question from Morgan. It looks like Morgan wants to know, who are the Senate staff POCs for the Eviction Crisis Act?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm happy to connect with you, Morgan, offline and give you some of those our contact names in those offices. So please feel free to reach out to me and I'll drop my email in the chat.
Thanks, Kim. And here's a question from Donna. Donna wants to know, does this address remedies for localities where landlords are opting out of Section 8?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it does not address that issue, although we know that it's a very, very important issue that does need to be addressed, but the Eviction Crisis Act is not the vehicle through which that we would be able to tackle that issue. Although, just to note, we are working closely with our partners at the federal, state, and local level to ensure that landlords have the opportunity to engage more with Section 8 rental assistance programs and have added incentives to admit voucher holding households, because we know it's a huge issue with voucher uptake.
All right, and we have a question from a viewer who wants to know, how much congressional support does the Eviction Crisis Act have currently?
Yeah, so right now we have a lot of support from congressional Democrats, and we're very excited that this is a bipartisan bill. We have a couple of Republicans signed on as co-sponsors as well. But I do think that we are trying to ensure that we shore up support among Republicans in the Senate in particular, to make sure that we kind of have that important balance on any bipartisan bill between Democratic and Republican supporters. So fortunately, we do have that bipartisan support that's so important to getting anything done on the Hill outside of the reconciliation process. And we are continuing to garner more support across party lines.
Okay, and it looks like we have one that just came in, it just moved. So Arend is asking, one of the things the bill requires is collecting data about illegal evictions. How is this information going to be collected? And then as a follow-up, Arend states, they're concerned because the evictions are not filed with a court, but are done without any court involvement, and it's hard to quantify. If there is no data, it could lead people to say there's no problem with illegal evictions.
Yeah, great question. So there is a component that would require the collection of data on illegal evictions, but as Arend very correctly points out in her question, it can be really difficult to gather that information. So I would actually have to look into the bill text and see how exactly that mechanism would work. And I would be happy to talk more about that with Arend offline and connect her to some of our partners at NHLP, the National Housing Law Project, and the ACLU to work through what are the best mechanisms to collect data about illegal lockouts and illegal evictions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kim. It looks like that is it for now. I know you'll be on for other questions as they come through, but also too, just as a reminder, please, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and also keep a check on the chat as well, because there's a lot of good information and links that are being placed in the chat for you. So thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much for those important updates. All right, so now let's transition to our next speaker and topic. So we're going to have Andrew Arend, who is the Vice President for Research with the Coalition. And Andrew is going to share NLIHC's annual gap report that was just released last week. The floor is all yours, Andrew.
All right, sorry about that little delay. Thanks, Renee. So as all of you know, the coalition's mission is to achieve socially and racially equitable public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are accessible and affordable in communities of their choice. And to that end, one of our annual reports is The Gap, in which we estimate the shortage of housing for renters with extremely low incomes. And typically in the housing field, extremely low income refers to households with incomes below 30% of their area median income or below poverty. Roughly speaking, below poverty would be less than $23,000 a year for a family of three. And last week, we released our 2022 GAP report. And I'm going to take a few minutes to review some of our main findings in this year's report. If you can go to the next slide, please. Renter households with extremely low incomes count for about a quarter of all renters in the United States. And the main point of the report is that we currently have a shortage of slightly more than 7 million rental homes affordable and available to them. And so this equates to having only 36 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income renters, or less than 4 for every 10 extremely low income renter. And on the next slide, our state map indicates that no state has an adequate supply of housing for low-income renters. The states with the most severe shortages have fewer than 30 homes for every 100 extremely low-income renter. Those states include, on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and on the East Coast, Florida. And the state with the least severe shortage still only has about 61 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low income renter, or about 6 for every 10 extremely low income renter. And that state is West Virginia. And I don't have a slide put up, but our report also includes data on the largest metropolitan areas. And you won't be surprised to learn that no metropolitan area has an adequate supply of housing that's affordable and available to extremely low income renters either. And so the shortage of housing is a national problem. And if you can go to the next slide, because of this shortage, more than 7 of every 10 renters with extremely low incomes are severely cost burdened, spending more than half of their incomes on rent. But this particular graph that I have here breaks down all renters who are severely cost burdened by their income. And clearly what this shows is that, the vast majority of severely cost-burdened renters in the United States, nearly 3/4 of them, have extremely low incomes. Another 20% have very low income, which is income between 31 and 50% of area median income. And only 1% of severely cost-burdened renters have incomes between 80% of area median income and the median. And sometimes we're asked who are extremely low income renters, and that's on the next slide. Most extremely low-income renters are seniors, people with disabilities, or they are in the labor force. Obviously, the categories in this pie chart are not mutually exclusive. A number of seniors and people with disabilities are also in the labor force. But what this chart really shows or indicates that easily more than a third of renters with extremely low incomes are in the labor force. Another 20% are seniors and 19% are people with disabilities, and many others are in school or they are single adult caregivers for children. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about racial disparities. And we see significant racial disparities in income and housing tenure that result in people of color being disproportionately impacted by the shortage of affordable rental housing for extremely low income renters. And this graph shows, that 1 in 5 or 20% of Black households are currently renters with extremely low incomes. 15% of Latino households are renters with extremely low incomes, compared to only 6% of white households. And these disparities stem from a wide variety of reasons, including barriers to home ownership for people of color, for example, greater wealth or intergenerational wealth among white households who can then use that wealth for home ownership. Or still today, we see inequitable access to mortgages and financing options that harm people of color. And so that people of color are more likely to be renters. In addition to barriers to home ownership, we also see racial disparities in income and in the labor market. For example, the median income of Black and Latino households is only 61% and 78% of the median income of white households. We see differences in educational opportunities. We still see discrimination in hiring. And during the pandemic, Black and Latino workers were more likely to lose income or employment during the pandemic than white workers were. So all of this, all of these disparities, both in the housing market and labor market and wealth, explain these disparities that we see in who are extremely low income renters. The other thing our report talks quite a bit about, if you want to go to the next slide, is that the private market does not adequately serve and will likely never adequately serve renters with extremely low incomes. You know, what they can afford to pay in rent definitely doesn't cover the cost of new development. And unfortunately, it often doesn't cover the cost of maintaining older properties in the private market. So as a result, you know, we need significant subsidies to help renters with extremely low incomes, which, you know, all of you are well aware of. We need both supply side subsidies, that is production, and demand side subsidies, and that is vouchers. The chart here that we included in the report is a scatter plot that represents each of the 50 largest metropolitan areas. And it represents the share of rental housing that are HUD assisted or subsidized housing, and the share of extremely low income renters that are severely cost burdened. And if you look at the left of the graph, upper left, they are metros with high shares of housing that is subsidized and lower shares of extremely low income renters that are cost burdened. And as you move to the right, you'll see that you'll start seeing metro areas with lower shares of rental housing that are subsidized. And meanwhile, you'll see higher rates of severe cost burdens among extremely low income renters, clearly showing the relationship between more subsidized housing and fewer rates of cost burdens or severe cost burdens among extremely low income renters. And so what we call for on the next slide is, of course, greater investment in our federal programs like the National Housing Trust Fund, like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and greater investment in public housing. And we talk in the report about the Build Back Better Act really set a benchmark for some of these funding levels that we would like to see come from some other act or negotiation process. That would be $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, $25 billion for Housing Choice Vouchers, and $65 billion for public housing. Those were the components of the Build Back Better Act. And I think I will stop there and answer any questions people may have.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So we do have a question from Jay. Jay wants to know, why is there a trend among the poorest states for having the most available and affordable housing?
So, I'm sorry, could you say that again? Why are there?
Yeah, Jay is saying that there seems to be a trend among the poorest states for having the most available and affordable housing. And he wants to know, why is that?
So there's a couple of reasons for, you know, areas where we have a least severe shortage. One would be, you know, a lower demand for housing in those areas. So that would be one, less expensive housing. I will say, though, that areas that have less expensive housing, incomes are also lower. So it still can be difficult to afford that housing. But that would be one reason. Another reason, although this doesn't exactly explain poor states, but, you know, one of the things that the scatter plot I just showed really highlights is that states and metropolitan areas that have a greater supply of subsidized housing tend to have a greater supply of housing for extremely low income renters. And so you could look at an expensive market, what many people think is an expensive market like Boston, and see, you know, over the past few years, we have regularly identified Boston as being a place with a least severe shortage, even though it's a high cost market. But that's because in cities like Boston, there's a significant supply of subsidized housing because they're older cities, and they developed that subsidized housing when we were investing significantly in that housing many decades ago. But I would say, to Jay's point, there is a supply of housing that's there. There's less demand for the rental housing, but there still isn't enough that would be affordable to extremely low income renters.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's see, it looks like we have a question from Stan. Stan says, where in the United States is there a state model rental housing program for very low income renters?
That's a very good question. One place that comes to mind that isn't a state, but I believe in California, Santa Clara County, I believe, or San Jose, they a couple of years ago implemented a housing trust fund, and they have funded that to serve extremely low income renters. And I think it was on a local ballot where they decided to do that. I mean, they have decided to target extremely low income renters with this trust fund. I think trust fund money is very important. Unfortunately, I will say a lot of local communities don't have the resources to do that, to fully meet the need. And so that's why we need state and federal resources as well. But can I add one more piece to that? So, there are a lot of affordable housing efforts. Unfortunately, a number of them tend to target higher income households, not high income, but low income, like very low income, at 50% of AMI, 60% of AMI, 80% of AMI. In some areas, that's very important. But in a number of areas, it's really the population that's below 30% of AMI that really experience that shortage of housing. And there's not a lot of programs at the local level that really target that population.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We have another question. Let's see. Sorry about that. Okay, so a question from Kim. Kim wants to know, are you able to identify any pandemic-related effects? One second. In the available data?
So that's a really good question. So in this year's report, I would say generally the GAP report really highlights sort of the longer term structural problems we have in our housing market and not serving extremely low income renters. One of the data challenges we had this year is we base our GAP report on the American Community Survey. The most recent data is 2020. But the Census Bureau had difficulty getting people to respond to the survey in 2020. And so 1 year of data they determined was not reliable. So this year's report is actually based on data from 2016 to 2020. So it doesn't capture the full impact of the pandemic. And so when we talk about this shortage of 7 million homes, that is really a structural shortage that, was in place before the pandemic, and it will be a shortage after the pandemic unless we directly address it. I will say in the report, we do talk about the impacts of the pandemic. We know the pandemic has exacerbated this shortage and the challenge for extremely low income renters. We know, and we talk about this in the report, that low income renters were more likely to lose employment during the pandemic and struggle to afford their housing. And we know that millions of renters are behind on paying their rent from the recent surveys. So we talk about that in the report as the pandemic exacerbates these problems. And the other thing I will say too is that one thing we don't fully capture is what's happening right now, which in the past year is a significant inflation in rental prices. That is also really impacting low income renters as well. That is not fully captured by these numbers because these numbers are from American Community Survey and they haven't captured the recent price changes. So in short, it's gotten worse.
Yeah, it definitely has. I think that is it, Andrew. Thank you so much for the report and congratulations to you and your team for such a very strong report. I'm sure you'll be able to stay on. We may have some additional questions that pop into the Q&A section. So if you can answer those, that would be great. But thank you again, Andrew, for such a great report. Well done. All right, so let's transition now to our next speaker. So we're going to hear from Jade Vasquez. Jade is with the Erase team, and Erase is End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions. And Jade is going to share the latest on the Erase project. Jade.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to share a quick update from the Erase cohort, which has been monitoring state and local ERA programs across the country and supporting and advocating for policy changes and program improvement to ensure that the $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance reaches the lowest income and most marginalized households. The Erase cohort recently authored and signed onto a letter urging the Biden administration and the Treasury Department to make publicly available disaggregated demographic data for all state and local emergency rental assistance programs. In February, Treasury released quarterly data on the demographics of ERA recipients in 2021. The national data revealed that about 2/3 of households served by ERA had extremely low incomes. More than 40% of households served identified as Black or African American, and approximately 20% identified as Hispanic or Latino, two groups that are most likely to be behind on rent and face the greatest risk of eviction. Although NLIHC and the Erase cohort appreciate Treasury's release of data on the total national distribution of ERA funds by race, ethnicity, gender, and income, Treasury has not released other critical data required by the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. This includes the acceptance rate of applicants for assistance, the type or types of assistance provided to each eligible household, the average amount of funding provided per eligible household receiving assistance, and the average number of monthly rental or utility payments that were covered by the funding amount that a household received. Treasury has also not released state and local demographic data. While some state and local ERA programs are providing distribution data by race, income, and other demographics regularly, many housing advocates have not been able to access this information, which has critical implications for their work and the distribution of the remaining ERA funds, which are about $22 billion left. National aggregates, while indicators of overall program success, are inadequate to inform local systems change, especially considering that there are more than 500 ERA programs across the country with different program policies and practices. The demographic data by state and local programs are essential in supporting the equitable distribution of ERA by allowing advocates and other stakeholders to identify any disparities that may exist on the local level, as well as determining where outreach and engagement efforts are best targeted for the remaining ERA funds. We know that the disproportionate economic effects of the pandemic have widened existing racial inequities, and Treasury's ERA program has been a critical tool to mitigate some of these effects. State and local demographic data would promote a better understanding of who is being served by ERA, which is critical to identifying areas for course corrections and planning for future efforts to assist households once all ERA is dispersed. So we hope that this letter will further pressure Treasury and the Biden administration to publicly release this data so that housing organizations can ensure that ERA programs are visible, accessible, and prevent evictions for the lowest income and most marginalized renters. And that concludes my update.
Thank you so much, Jade. It doesn't look like we have any questions, but again, just as a reminder, we have a lot of great links in the chat. And so I see that Elena just put the letter, the cohort's letter that Jade just referenced. She has a link to it in the chat. So please do take a look at it. And thank you so much, Jade. Actually, Jade, hold on one second. We may have, oh no other questions. So, but hang on and stay around. We may have some questions to pop in.
Thank you.
Indeed. All right, and so I have the pleasure of also introducing Cody Glazer, who is with the Florida Housing Coalition. And Cody, I believe today is going to talk about the work that they're doing around Erase. Cody, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Renee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cody Glazer, and I'm excited to be sharing with you all some of the work that we've done recently under our Erase cohort grant, specifically about the SLFRF program. So I believe there's some slides to share. Go to the next slide. You can go one more. Perfect. So I'm really glad today to be able to share the work we've done on the Coronavirus Fiscal Recovery Fund program that was created in the American Rescue Plan. But first, a little bit about who we are and sort of the work we've done under Erase so far. We are a proud member of the Erase cohort. And the Florida Housing Coalition is primarily a training and technical assistance provider, mostly to local governments, but also a few nonprofit housing developers as well. And so a main focus of our Erase work to date has been providing free training and TA to the 32 local governments in Florida that got a direct allocation from Treasury through ERAP. And so our work to date, we facilitated 8 monthly workshops so far, with ERAP administrators, with legal aid attorneys, tenants' rights groups from all around the state. to talk about best practices for ERAP programs and eviction prevention generally. And we've also been able to provide free TA to a number of local governments across the state on a number of eviction prevention issues, including program and admin for ERAP, eviction process in general, and a lot more. And so basically for today, what we wanted to share was how our race work has evolved a little bit now that we're kind of nearing the end of the year-long work with National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And we are really heavily focused right now on SLFRF advocacy. If you go to the next slide, what we have really seen in Florida is we want to build on the momentum of ERAP. There are a number of our bigger local governments in Florida have either spent all their ERAP funds or are very close to spending all their ERAP money. And so we really want to see that momentum continue into more permanent solutions. And the most pressing program we think right now to focus on in Florida has been this State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund program, or SLFRF. And we really do see this as a once in a generation opportunity for local governments in Florida to address the affordable housing crisis. And so just to give you an idea of what we're working with, there are 67 counties and 77 cities in Florida that got money through the SLFRF program. Another 335 smaller cities are eligible for funding through the state. And we really don't think it's being dramatic or hyperbole to say this is a once in a generation opportunity, because if you just look at the dollar amounts that local governments have gotten through this program and compared that to what they would typically get for their state or federal housing program, this SLFRF money is huge. Just showing you some of the dollar amounts below. Places like Broward County are getting almost $380 million. Miami-Dade received almost $530 million. The dollar amounts are staggering. And so we are really taking a two-part game plan, if you will, for how to address this program and making sure that folks spend this money on housing. The first prong is to provide education advocacy. One of the main challenges to date is that the SLFRF program isn't necessarily an affordable housing program. It's primarily a COVID response program. And so it's really our goal to make sure that as many people as possible are aware of how this money can be used for affordable housing and just the big opportunity that we have right now, because we don't address this problem now, this money will be gone. It'll be an opportunity wasted. So after I'll talk a little about what we've done for education. We're also providing technical assistance on the back end to local governments for how to implement the program. So one of the things we find a lot through our advocacy is that if a local government staff isn't crystal clear or doesn't feel 100% about complying with federal regulations, they may not do something. They may move on to the next best thing. And so really it is our goal to, one, provide education on how these funds can be used, and also provide really in the weeds assistance on implementing it so that folks really move this forward. And so in terms of education and advocacy so far in SLFRF, really our main message in Florida has been that while these ARPA dollars can be used on a bunch of different things, there are few issues as urgent as the affordable housing crisis. And so for those who are familiar with this program know this is an extremely broad program. It can be spent on a lot of different things, of which affordable housing is just one of those uses. And so as with all things budget, budget is priorities. And so we're just really trying to hammer the message home that, if folks aren't using their money for affordable housing, why not? And then just kind of turn the conversation to priorities and making sure that folks are at least devoting a portion of their funds to the affordable housing crisis. And some of the ways that we've done that successfully are just by showing the opportunity. We found that it's been very successful just to compare what local governments would get annually in their state money versus what they have now in ARPA. So if you look at this chart below, just as an example, places like Broward County, their ARPA allocation is 114 times what they would get in state housing money each year. For smaller cities like Gainesville, this SLFRF allocation is 25 times what they would get in their state housing money each year. So we're really trying to show the opportunity to show how much money this is and provide really clear messages for how this money can be used for housing purposes. And so as I mentioned briefly in the last slide, one of our main priorities for this SLFRF work is just make it as clear as possible for what is out there. And because this is an incredibly broad program, what we've really tried to do is just break it down for how many uses are possible with this money. And just as an example, this is just one of the PowerPoint slides we've used before in a training with elected officials, just breaking down to like how many things this can fund. It can fund things from construction costs to down payment assistance, to rent and mortgage assistance, to vouchers, to title clearing, to everything. I always tell folks, imagine your idea is okay unless something expressly says it's not, because this program is so broad. And so in our education advocacy work, you really have just kind of fill in the blank there. Whenever you're talking to your local commissioner, just let them know how broad this program is and then fill your ideas into what the program allows. Next. And so also as part of our work for SLFRF, we provided some just basic ideas for funding. These are some of our main priorities of our work with local elected officials and housing nonprofits. This money can be used for shovel-ready housing projects that may have been delayed due to increased costs. It can be used for land acquisition for affordable housing, helping those nonprofit groups compete with institutional investors, which is a huge deal in Florida. We've also provided education and outreach on how this money can continue ERAP efforts. So if you are living in a local government that their ERAP funds are slowly getting to that finish line, SLFRF can keep your rent assistance programs going. So we've been working on that as well. And we've also been providing training on how this money can be used for site prep, down payment assistance, closing costs, and even operational support to nonprofits. So like I mentioned, we have a two-pronged approach: education, advocacy, as well as technical assistance on the back end. And so through our RACE grants and through other opportunities, we have been providing, we have been getting reached out to from local governments on very implementation-specific technical assistance. And so we've gotten questions from folks like, how do we continue our emergency rent program with this money? To questions like, how do we structure this as a long-term loan versus a grant? Really in the weeds of this, because as I mentioned before, in our technical assistance work, we found is that if a local government just doesn't feel comfortable complying with federal program guidelines, they might not do the affordable housing activity that you're advocating for. And so I think by doing the approach on education on one side, but also like very specific implementation on the back end, you can get a lot of good things done. And so we've already started to dive into some of those in the weeds questions with this grant as well. And so just finally, I'm going to leave you all with some really good examples we have from Florida of how folks are using their SLFRF dollars for affordable housing. We have a leaderboard that we're actually going to share at our conference this year. And in Florida, St. Petersburg is the leader in our state in terms of the proportion of funds that they have spent on affordable housing or have dedicated to affordable housing. So you'll see St. Petersburg has dedicated they dedicated over 3/4 of their ARPA money towards affordable housing, totaling $34 million. Sarasota County has dedicated $25 million to housing affordability. Tampa, $16 million. Broward, even up to $49 million. So we're seeing a pretty big dollar amount for a lot of local governments in Florida. If you go to the next slide, you'll see even more of them. So we have a lot of good examples from Florida for folks who are dedicating their money towards affordable housing. And I'm happy to answer any questions or any ideas for how to advocate for this money at the local level.
Thank you so much, Cody. Great report. It looks like we have 2 questions that have come in so far. So one question is from Juan. And Juan is saying, thank you for your work, Cody. Juan is saying, I've seen a lot of stories coming from Florida in the news of people that get approved and end up evicted or that never get the money, just anecdotally. And from these stories in the media, it feels more common in Florida than in other states. Are you seeing this too? And do you think this might be the case, and how this could educate the way that ARPA funds are distributed?
Yeah, we've had a lot of heartbreaking stories in Florida of just that, of folks being approved for the state program or their local programs, and then being evicted anyways. And I think those stories are what could generate interest in how a local government could spend their own money. So one of the previous slides, places like Collier County has devoted $7.5 million of their ARPA money on rent assistance. We have had a lot of stories about that in Florida. And one of the issues is just our landlord-tenant system, our legal system in Florida. If the judge isn't aware that the rent was fully paid, they may just go ahead and proceed with the eviction. Like, it's just a lot of notice issues, a lot of just like communication barriers, which is within our court system. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately to say, I think those stories can generate more interest in devoting these funds for more rent assistance, no matter how heartbreaking they are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cody. You're getting a lot of nice praise, if you will, in the chat, saying great work on what you're doing in Florida. We do have a question from James. James wants to know, or James is saying that he works for a nonprofit housing organization in Orlando. How do you get involved in the program?
Yeah, so right now in Florida, and this is probably the same way in other parts of the country, is that they've already have one half of their money given to them, each local government, and the second half is coming either in May or June of this year. So what we found is that local governments have already planned for the first half of money, but may not have planned for that second half of the money that they're getting. So there's still opportunities right now to talk to elected officials, talk to housing staff, just to put it on their radar that this money can and should be used for affordable housing. So I would just start by sending like individual emails to your city or county commissioner to say like, this is a priority, this can be funded, you should do this. And we do have like a one page on our website that will just help explain like in the most simple way we could, and with breaking down like 20 pages of federal regs, like how this money can be used. So I think just education, just bugging people about making this a priority is a really good way to start. And it would just start at the elected official level, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cody. I think that's it for the questions. I don't know if we may have a few more questions to come in. I don't know how long you'll be able to hang around, but thank you so very much for all the work that you're doing in Florida and for that great report. I'm certain it's going to be helpful to advocates throughout the country. So thank you, Cody.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to turn to our partners in the field to hear what's happening in Illinois and also in Vermont. So I'm first going to turn it over to Bob Palmer, who is with he's with Housing Action Illinois. Bob, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks, Renee. And there's my name. There's my name again and my contact info. You can go to the next slide. So I'm actually going to talk about some things that others have also talked about on the call today. In Illinois, we just finished our General Assembly session. They adjourned earlier this year than usual. So they finished up on April 8th. But in this condensed session, we had 3 significant victories that briefly want to touch base on. One is there was an earlier question in the meeting about source of income protection legislation and what can be done to protect tenants from landlords who, for example, refuse to accept housing choice vouchers or other type of non-wage income. So this is an issue that we've been working on in Illinois for a very long time. I've been at Housing Action Illinois for about 20 years. And one of the first campaigns I worked on in coalition with many other groups was to pass statewide source of income protection. And we were not able to get the bill passed way back when. This was like in 2003, 2004. In our House of Representatives, you need 60 votes to pass. I remember one time the bill got voted on and only got 39 votes, which we're all pretty disappointed about at the time. But we've kept working on it in various ways over the years. So finally, in this session, House Bill 2775, adding source of income protections to the Illinois Human Rights Act, passed. This was a big coalition effort. We had a coalition called the Illinois Coalition for Fair Housing that came together specifically to pass this bill. It included fair housing groups and housing advocates, but other groups like faith-based groups, labor organizations like the service employees, union groups that work with people with disabilities, immigrants' rights groups, all sorts of organizations. And it's going to protect people who have any type of non-wage income like Social Security or alimony. But really all the debate around the bill historically has mostly been around housing choice voucher holders, because there are certain interest groups, mostly representing rental property owners, that say that housing choice vouchers are not a source of income, it's a government program. And if we have source of income protection, it's a mandate to participate in a government program, which we disagree with. We think that housing choice vouchers should be treated like a source of income, just like anything else. Landlords still get to choose who they're going to rent to. They can do their tenant screening criteria and check people's references and so forth. They just can't turn someone down solely because they have a housing choice voucher or other non-wage income. So we're very confident that Governor Pritzker is going to sign this bill into law in Illinois, and it would go into effect on January 1 of 2023. And once the bill becomes law, Illinois will be the 20th state plus the District of Columbia with these source of income protections. So we can go to the next slide. And again, this just kind of summarizes the coalition that I described before, and also our two sponsors, LaShawn Ford and State Senator Ron Villivalum, who are a big part of the effort. And there's more info on our website if you want it. You can go to the next slide. So two other things I'm going to share, budget related, kind of actually building on Cody's presentation from Florida. In Illinois, again, part of a big coalition effort of more than 100 supporting organizations and lots of members in the General Assembly that are listed at the end of this slide, both in the House and Senate. We were successful in getting the Illinois General Assembly to commit $150 million in additional ARPA funds for affordable housing. And then the second bullet point on the slide, you see this is actually an investment building on an earlier commitment of $114 million in ARPA funds. So that's a total of $264 million. That third bullet point on the slide goes into a lot of detail about what the funds can be used for. Basically, the first pot of funds was for gap financing for low-income housing tax credit projects, supportive housing in various ways. And the second pot of funds, the $150 million, can also be used for those purposes, but our legislative champion on the floor, Representative Will Guzzardi, read out a legislative intent statement saying that the funds can be used for additional purposes, including resources for returning residents, that is reentry housing, loan assistance for existing homeowners, outreach for homelessness prevention, and funding programs that preserve community integrity. That might be like a community land trust. So we're very excited about that and spending those dollars between now and 2026. You can go to the next slide. These are just some of the key messages that we use to support our ARPA investment, like funding housing creates jobs, promotes racial justice, for example, by funding reentry housing, using all the data that Andrew shared earlier in the GAP report and how many extremely low-income renters are severely cost burdened, supporting state planning to end homelessness, and leveraging other resources like the federal low-income housing tax credit. And then the next slide. And then lastly, we did have one more budget victory. We were able to convince members of the General Assembly to take some money that they had committed in the current fiscal year for eviction mitigation purposes to help service providers, largely to help distribute emergency rent assistance, but also provide legal representation to renters. The state is going to maintain that, particularly the legal representation to renters and also landlords in certain cases, but a lot of the funding to help social service agencies distribute emergency rent assistance is no longer necessary because those dollars from the federal government have been spent. So we are very glad that Illinois basically recommitted those dollars to efforts to end homelessness for homelessness prevention and other purposes. So it's not very often in Illinois that we get a $15 million increase for our long underfunded homeless service delivery system. So I was very glad to share those updates with you. And if there's any time, we can have questions.
Thank you so much, Bob, and congratulations. That's such great news. Such great news. We do have, it looks like we have a question from Megan. Megan wants to know, well, Megan says that they would like to push local support for income protections, but Megan is saying that she's curious if you have more details on possible pushback and how to implement programs successfully, including enforcement.
You're welcome to get in touch with me after the meeting. That's probably a longer question than I can answer right now. I would just say that we just kept pushing on our main messages. We did have some opposition until the very end from one statewide landlords association, but very importantly, we were able to get the Illinois realtors to negotiate with us on some of the bill language around the definition of source of income, but we maintain our commitment to, having source of income protection that would protect voucher holders. And essentially, after many, many years of effort, we're able to get them to change their mind. And just at the very end of the session, they came out in support of the bill. So we're very glad about that. So you just got to do the work and keep pushing the main messages and telling stories of people impacted. And I think the fact, the timing that it passed now, during the pandemic, or hopefully, close to the end of the pandemic, and there's been such focus on maintaining people's housing through the federal emergency rent assistance. And we did share lots of stories about, how the emergency rent assistance has helped, but also it hasn't helped everyone it could, because there have been landlords that refuse to participate. And I think that influenced how a lot of legislators in our General Assembly thought about this issue and how important it is.
Great, thank you, Bob. We have a question from Jerry. Jerry wants to know, Bob, if you can say more about the land trust efforts and how much funding and how many localities will be participating in this program?
Very good. So I think actually it's to be determined. There'll be negotiations with our state housing finance agency, the Illinois Housing Development Authority, about the specifics of how these dollars will be spent. So there's not necessarily any funds committed for community land trusts out of the ARPA funds, but we're hopeful that at least some will be used for that. Our Housing Development Authority in recent years has really got into funding community land banks that are kind of a related type of legal entity to help rehabilitate abandoned property. And then there's kind of been a resurgence, particularly in certain communities in Chicago that are experiencing gentrification and creating community land trusts to help preserve affordable housing, both for renters and owners. And so that's going to be part of the mix of potential uses for this funding that we've been able to secure.
Thank you. We have a question from Mark. Mark wants to know, how long did it take to pass this? How many years in Illinois? And Mark says that in Pennsylvania, they're at square one and would like to address this issue.
Well, as I said, for the source of income, we did start working on it, like back in 2003. We didn't work on it continuously since then. There was work on some local campaigns between back in 2003 and now that were successful in getting some local governments in Illinois to pass source of income protection, including housing choice vouchers. And then we did another state legislative push in 2017 that wasn't successful. So it took a long time here, but I know there's some other states recently that have passed source of income protection, like Maryland and Rhode Island. And so I don't think all the states have taken as long as it has here in Illinois. So I think there's certainly things to learn from our campaign, but hopefully others can do it more quickly than we did.
And here's a question: was there legislative language around the enforcement of the new source of income protections?
That is one thing that we negotiated with the realtors. We originally, in the first version of the bill, if you look it up online, you'll see it had a very detailed definition of what source of income is, with lots of different examples, and it's specifically named housing choice vouchers, it's specifically named emergency rent assistance programs. We already have, there are some local governments, as I said, in Illinois, including Chicago and Cook County, which is the biggest county in Illinois, that have source of income protections that have kind of a shorter, more general definition that we feel, based on the experience of those ordinances, also covers housing choice vouchers and emergency rent assistance. And so in our negotiations on the bill, we agreed to use that shorter, more general source of income definition, which again, we feel will work well based on other things, other language in the final bill. So.
Excellent. And we have another question. You have a lot of questions today, Bob.
Okay.
We have a question from Shanta. Shanta wants to know, how can we get funding for the land trust?
Well, I don't think I can answer that one. I'm not knowing where Shanta is. I think, again, this is sort of an emerging area, at least in terms of public funding in Illinois. So we're still working on it too. And there is actually, Housing Action Illinois, we're in the position of trying to support other groups that are starting land trusts and kind of working on them full time. So again, if the person wants to email me after the meeting, I'll put my email in the chat. I can give them info on the specific land trusts in the Chicago area and other parts of Illinois.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. And that is it. Thank you, Kim, Bob. Congratulations. That's a big win. But I know that it took a lot of effort from a lot of people and a lot of organizations. So congratulations.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks for having me on the call today.
Absolutely. All right, and so let's turn to Vermont. We have our partner from Vermont, Jess Hyman, who is from the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. Jess, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Renee. It's a pleasure to be here. And Bob, I'm going to echo that congratulations. It's really wonderful to see more states adding a source of income to their protections. So I'm Jess Hyman. I'm the Associate Director of Statewide Advocacy Programs at CVOEO, and I'm also on the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition Steering Committee. And I'm here today to talk to you about Fair Housing Month, which is April this month, and some of the ways that we celebrate it in Vermont and some of the creative ways that we use Fair Housing Month to engage the community and try and change the public will for affordable, inclusive housing. So CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, is one of the state's 5 community action agencies, and we address the fundamental issues of economic, racial, social, and environmental justice, and we work with people to achieve economic independence. And our statewide housing advocacy programs include Vermont Tenants, which has a hotline for renters, and we offer workshops on renters' rights and responsibilities, finding housing, and more. We have a mobile home program that provides support, advocacy, and technical assistance for mobile home residents, and then also the Fair Housing Project, where I spend a lot of my time. And so we are an education and outreach program. We don't do enforcement. We have some wonderful state partners who do fair housing enforcement. And so what we do is we provide consultations for people who are experiencing discrimination and make referrals to our enforcement partners at the Vermont Human Rights Commission and at HUD and Vermont and connect people with Vermont Legal Aid for support and to file complaints. And we do workshops and trainings for housing and service providers and municipal officials and the public. And then we also work with local housing committees and local regional planning commissions and statewide organizations with the goal of increasing the amount of affordable, inclusive housing. So for Fair Housing Month, which of course, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, it marks the anniversary of the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968, which put essential protections into law against discrimination and harassment, and also requires communities to take steps to undo the historical patterns of segregation and exclusion that were created by federal housing policy and reinforced over generations. And so Fair Housing Month is also time to renew our fight for safe, stable, and affordable housing for everyone. So these laws that we have on the books, the federal protections against against discrimination based on race, skin color, national origin, religion, sex, and disability and family status have been around for a long time. And states have the ability to add additional protections, just like we heard from Bob in Illinois, very exciting. And in Vermont, we've added quite a few protections as well. So we've added marital status, age, sexual orientation and gender identity, and receipt of public assistance. So that's what we call our essentially source of income protection. And so that includes any public assistance. So housing choice vouchers, food stamps, reach up, and any type of public assistance. We also have a brand new protected class, well, brand new, it's a couple of years old, from 2019, protections for victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And that was added a few years ago as part of a broader swath of renter protections for people who have experienced abuse. And then we also have a really lovely anti-NIMBY protection protection, which is a protection against the denial of development permitting based on the income of prospective residents. So despite all this, despite the state fair housing law, the federal fair housing law, discrimination and harassment still happens. People are treated unfairly, as we all know. And it's underreported, it's hard to prove, and people often put up with this out of fear of retaliation or losing their homes in a tight housing market, how we have now. And as we know, the pandemic has only exacerbated this issue. Also, our towns and our cities and our countries still have patterns of systemic discrimination that are embedded into the ways that we organize our communities and we plan our towns. So in Vermont, just about half of the complaints, fair housing complaints, are based on disability, followed by family status, so having the presence of minor children, and then race or national origin. And as I said before, only a small percentage of the instances of housing discrimination ever get reported, and only a small percentage of those make it through the courts. And so this issue of people being denied access to housing simply because of who they are is part of this bigger housing issue. And so what we really want to see, obviously, is for everyone to have the opportunity to have safe, affordable, and inclusive housing. And so change is happening. Lots of towns are looking at their zoning, identifying ways to make homes more accessible to people. We're building more homes. There's tons of federal money coming into to lots of programs, and it should help if everyone has equitable access to these homes, especially people traditionally subject to discrimination and exclusion, because we need to ensure vibrant, thriving communities. So that's what we focus on for Fair Housing Month. It took me a while to get to the point here. So when we do our Fair Housing Month activities, we take the opportunity to not just raise awareness about fair housing law, but to celebrate what inclusive community is all about. And we do that through a number of creative activities, and specifically the arts. So we partner with a bunch of different organizations, including the Vermont Department of Libraries, Vermont Legal Aid, the Human Rights Commission, the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition, a bunch of arts organizations, and even a community garden organization that does garden work at housing sites. And this year's theme is inclusive communities and the importance of home. So we have a bunch of great activities. I'm going to put, after when I'm done talking, I'll put the link in the chat so you can see. But what I really wanted to focus on is a few of the things that I think are a little unique. And then one is, in addition to the informational workshops that we present throughout the month, similar to what we do throughout the year, we have a series of Fair Housing Friday webinars. And these are discussions that dig really deep into things like the need for language access and supportive services and affordable housing, the challenge and opportunities of mobile home communities, and why simply building more homes isn't enough. That's the one that's coming up this Friday. And then the partnership with the Department of Libraries allows us to reach out into communities all over the state. And many libraries are leading book discussions and holding other library events, and there are youth-focused events, even some in person, which is absolutely wonderful after 2 years of only remote activities. And then our arts projects, which to me, I think are just the heart and soul of our Fair Housing Month activities. We have a project called the Heart and Home Community Art Project, and we include prompts that we share to help people think creatively about what home and community and inclusivity mean. And through our partnership with the libraries, we sent out about 1,000 art kits all over the state to libraries and housing sites. There's an exhibit, there's an art contest, online art activities. We have excuse me, art display up at City Hall in Burlington. And what's really wonderful is the way that having folks express what home and community and inclusivity means to them is a way to start really good conversations about housing. And this is, I think, one of the best ways that we can change the public will for affordable housing and get more people talking and thinking about it. So I'm going to put some links in the chat so you can see some of these activities. Most of the activities are online, so you can invite you all to join us, or you can see recordings of activities that have already happened. I also encourage you to share the art prompts, steal them, use them yourself, use them in your own organizations. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jess. That sounds so exciting. Thank you for sharing all those great ideas with us as well. Those are wonderful. And I'm sure that people, because I do see the chat feed is lighting up, so people are really interested in more details. And I do see that you share the link, so thank you for doing that. It looks like we have one question that has come in from Jerry. And Jerry wants to know, is there a comprehensive list of all the Vermont fair housing protections?
Oh, most definitely. I will put a link in the chat for you.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you so much, Jess. And again, thank you so much for sharing all those great ideas with us. And good luck with all the work that you're doing there.
Thank you.
All right. And that actually brings us to the end of this call. So we will post the recording of today's webinar to the website, and you can visit our website at www.nlihc.org for more information. And also be on the lookout for an email with a link to the recording and the slides that were shown as well. So you'll receive that as in an email as well. So our next call, so next week, which will be May the 2nd, which is really strange that, yes, we will be in May. But next week's call, which is Monday, May the 2nd, we're going to feature Our Homes, Our Votes, the series. And it will be on legal considerations for nonprofits, nonprofit organizations. So we really want nonprofits, to know, because nonprofits can and should participate in nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement. And we want you to do so confidently. So we will have a session on May the 2nd at the same time slot to go over some of the things, the laws that you need to know that govern nonprofit election related work. So please register for that if you haven't already. And let's see if I can drop a link to. Okay, and you should have in the chat a link to register for that as well. And then also our next HoUSed call is scheduled for May the 9th at the same time. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. Thank you all for joining today's call, and we will see you hopefully next week. Take care, everyone.